Welcome to Dates with Death, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking's podcast series dedicated to death and all that comes with it. For a long time, the topic of death has been considered as taboo in the West, even almost completely banished from our lives. This has come as a price. So we take it upon ourselves to re-inaugurate the quintessential philosophical task, at least according to Cicero, namely to meditate upon death. In today's date, it is my great pleasure to be accompanied by Rabbi Simcha Raphael, who is a psychotherapist and the founding director of the Vanhoutte Institute for Death Awareness Advocacy and Training. Hello, Simcha, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and look forward to our conversation.
It's a great pleasure. Now, as has become the habit here at Dates with Death, I would like to start by asking you the basic question of why death? Why, when, and how did you become interested in the peculiar object of Jewish or Judaic death?
People ask me this question, when did you get into death? And I say, well, it's not that I got into death, death got into me. So there are a couple of ways in which I tell the story. One of them was when I was in my early 20s, my closest friend was killed in a car accident. I had been with him one evening and he left. We said our goodbyes, and I had a woman friend, a date that night, and we were out on the streets of Montreal at 2 o'clock in the morning. And we came out of a cafe, and I pointed to the moon. It was a full moon that night, and I said, "There's something very auspicious about that moon. I don't know what it is, but there's something very auspicious about that moon." I took her home. I went home. I went to sleep. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. It was another friend of mine telling me that that friend that I had been with earlier that evening in the car accident. And around 2 o'clock in the morning, the friend who was on the phone had been IDing his body in the morgue.
Mm.
And if you would have said to me, simply, you're going to spend many years of your life having conversations with people about dying and death, I would have said, you know what, forget it. That's not my plan. But very early on, I felt a sense of his presence.
Mm.
Very early on, there were moments of meaningful coincidences, of really felt presence. I mean, I remember the cemetery, Mount Pleasant Memorial Park. There was nothing pleasant about Mount Pleasant Memorial Park burying a 22-year-old kid in the dead of winter. I felt his presence there. Jews, as you may or other people may or may not be familiar with, do a ritual called sitting Shiva, which is 7 days of collective mourning.
Mm.
And we were sitting in what we call the Shiva house, and one of us turned to another. Didn't it feel like he was just in the room now? And yet, in my own tradition, as a Jewish kid, I was a kid at that point who already had an undergraduate degree in history and philosophy of religion, and I was reasonably educated in Jewish belief and practice. There was very, very little available
Mm.
for me about this question about survival of consciousness after death. I could go to the spiritualist literature. I could go to Eastern traditions, but there was very little at that time, and this is over 40 years ago, about what Judaism had to say about life after death. So that really, really started me on a kind of individual search, both emotionally to deal with such a loss. It was traumatic at that point, and intellectually because I was sort of already spiritually curious.
Mm.
And again, it's also a longer story, but I ended up writing my PhD dissertation on death and afterlife in Jewish tradition with applications for working with the dying and bereaved. And then that became Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And then I worked for a while as a resident psychologist in a funeral home. And the rest is history, but I've been having conversations with people about dying and death, and I didn't even know that's what Cicero had to say. But I guess I've been meditating on death my whole life in various ways. So that's one weave on the story. Why death?
Okay, thanks. Now, if we get a little bit more on the theoretical level, now up until not so long ago, also as you just said it was widely held, both outside and inside the Jewish communities, that Judaism itself, at least ancient Judaism, had hardly any interest in life after death. Scholars kept on repeating that there was no ongoing relationship with the ancestors in Judaism, that there certainly weren't any ghosts there, and Judaic funerary rituals and its afterlife were incredibly underdeveloped, at least that was claimed. Now, we know that this is not exactly the case. Can you please say something about ancient Jewish ideas about life after death, about ancestor relationships, maybe also about funerary rites, about ghosts, basically about this Judaic relationship to the afterlife?
Well, I first need to say this whole notion that Judaism doesn't have a belief in afterlife, period, is really a modern notion, and often the the enlightened scholars or the post-enlightenment scholars, they may not be so enlightened, the post-enlightenment scholars read Jewish history and Jewish texts through a rationalist lens. So when you say there's no belief in afterlife in the Bible, it's true, but it may not be the whole truth, and I want to speak to that, because part of what we're dealing with is a modern take on the historical past. But so if I go into the historical past in what I would call a phenomenological sense, in other words, what are the phenomena that we observe in the historical past? Well, Judaism has a great edict against thou shalt not have other gods before me. Judaism claims to be, or at least biblical scholars claim of Judaism, that it is sort of the initial monotheistic cry in the ancient world of polytheism. And those other traditions, they worship the ancestors. We only worship the one God who gave us the Torah at Sinai. At least, at least that's the operating belief. So part of the reticence, the discomfort around a kind of ancestral cult, if you will, that was common in the ancient Near Eastern world at the time, is a kind of anti-polytheistic bias within Judaism. That being said, that's not the whole truth. That in fact, the bamot, the high places, we read in the Book of Kings and elsewhere that we read that Solomon built bamot, high places to the strange gods, to the non-Yahwistic, to use a term that I don't really like anyways, but the non-monotheistic gods. Well, guess what? They were doing burial there. There were different kinds of funerary practices that took place around that. So some of what we need to do to go to see what was going on in the ancient world is doing some kind of sacred archaeology and revisioning or looking again at some of the texts almost in an anthropological sense to see, oh yeah, maybe there was some sense of a connection with afterlife and with ancestors. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of the modern view looking backwards, the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried, and Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah were buried, is still a hot spot in modern Israel, in Hebron. Rachel's Kever Rachel, Rachel's grave, Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem is still a hotspot. So while there's not, quote, ancestor worship, there certainly is, even to the modern times, a kind of connection back to those sacred sites of burial. You'd appreciate this, actually. I have a study partner in Judaism. We have something called Chavruta, where two people study a text together. So I have a guy. We get together on Zoom every couple of weeks. I'm reading a coffee table book in Hebrew that's called Sacred Burial Sites of Modern Israel. So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of sacred sites of tombs of ancient rabbis and biblical personages. So while the Western world doesn't recognize, quote unquote, ancestor worship as part of the biblical tradition, in both touristy Israel and in Orthodox Israel, there's a lot of ancestor worship still going on to this day.
And it goes back to the ancient past.
Well, it's one thing if you're in a European or an American city. It's another thing if you're in the Holy Land itself, and there's a grave site of one of the kings of Israel, or in the Galilee there are all these graves of the rabbis of the rabbinic period, and people go to those grave sites in search of blessing.
Some other things that I've had conversations on death with scholars in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and in Egypt. There are these things that always come back, and when I was reading your book, I seem to have found them there as well. There are forms of necromancy. There are forms of feeding the dead in their grave. So there's a whole type of practice. You call that one should do the phenomenology of sacred archaeology. But these things always come back over and over again. And in a certain sense, it would also make sense, I think, that in Israel, these things would also be present because they were surrounded by peoples who had these practices, and also the ancient Israeli tribes. They spent lots of their times in these countries like Egypt or in Persia.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, one of the texts that I like to teach is the story of and the Witch of Endor, as she is called. King Saul was the first king of ancient Israel. We would date him roughly around 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. And he's a warrior. He's fighting the Philistines. He's on the battlefield, and he's about to lose everything in battle. And he tries to contact his God. We used to say in Hebrew, Yud Hey Vav Hey. The Protestant scholars say Yahweh. The German biblical scholars say Jehovah. That God, right? As my teacher would say, our Father, what's God's name? God's name is Harold. Our Father who art in heaven, Harold be thy name. So he's trying to communicate through what he referred to as the Urim and Tumim. The Urim and Tumim was an oracular breastplate that the high priests would use. There was a whole oracular tradition. That's another podcast for another time. And he says, I try to communicate with God through the Urim and Tumim. I didn't get an answer. I try to communicate through dreams or prophecy. Prophecy is a kind of altered state of being receptive to divine communication. He says that, and I didn't get any answer. I couldn't get online. So he gathers a posse. He gathers a group of his men, his attendants, and they go in disguise to the town of Endor to see this woman who is a medium, a psychic. Now, the reason why he has to go in disguise is because there has been a ban against those kind of soothsayers.
Mm.
Because of the anti-polytheistic, because of the monotheistic purification process that was going on at that time, weeding
Mm.
out any non-monotheistic elements, the medium, the cult, the guild of women psychics were basically banned. So he
Mm.
goes, he goes in disguise, and he goes to this woman and says, "Bring up for me somebody from the underworld. Who do you want? Bring up my teacher and mentor, the prophet Samuel." Samuel was the one who chose and ordained Saul,
Mhm.
and Samuel, the woman has a vision and says to Saul, says, "What do you see?" He says, "I see this man coming up with a cloak." And Samuel says, "Why the hell are you bothering me? Leave me alone. I'm doing fine here. Thank you very much. You're gonna die. You didn't listen to what God had asked you to do." And so it's a longer story, but what's the point? The point is that there's a biblical text which has very specific reference to being able to access the soul or the spirit of someone who is deceased, and it's he comes up. So
Mm.
there's an underworld of the dead. That's
Mm.
a very enigmatic text for modern Judaism as well. Jews don't believe in life after death, and
Mm.
then you have something like that.
Mm.
So that's one kind of element. I wouldn't call it ancestor worship, but certainly there's a sense of an interconnection between the world of the living and the world of the dead.
Mm. Yeah, and turning back maybe to the more technical issue here, you already said that so modern Judaism, and in a certain sense, doesn't like the fact that there are these aspects in ancient Judaic tradition, but these modern interpretations they can't just go to the fact and say that it was embedded, for example, by the redaction by the editorial team, if one can call it like that, of the radical monotheists of the Pentateuch of the first five books, because it's still there. So how can they hold on to these views, to these understanding that there was no interest in the afterlife? Because I was very surprised by that when I started reading up on ancient Judaic traditions and the afterlife, that there is this continuous understanding or this continuous stress on the fact that there was no belief in the afterlife in ancient Judaism, and
Well, look,
they yes.
you go on. You finish your thought, and then I'll interrupt you later.
No, so these one of the things that I read most of was that it was because of redactorial interference that of or by the radical monotheists that a lot of these aspects disappeared, but they're still there. So
Well,
if the redactorial interference was so harsh, then why are still these sources there?
wait, we have two screens open, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
One is what modern Jews believe, and the other is what's in the biblical text.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going back and forth. But when my closest friend was killed in a car accident, as I said earlier, one of the things I would often read is Jews do not believe in the hereafter as other religions do. One of the reasons other religions do, meaning Christians do and
Mm-hmm.
Jews don't, we believe in the here and now. And as I like to say when I do my own teaching, that's true, but it's only half true. What's true is Judaism does have an emphasis on the here and now. It's in this world where we perform the mitzvot, the commandments, and even when we think about a future time of messianic transformation, unlike St. Paul, it's not going to happen in a heavenly realm. It's going to be, we become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and we transform the human realm.
Mm-hmm.
But That doesn't mean that Jews don't believe in life after death. In
mm,
the pre-modern period,
mm,
in the world of Isaac Bashevis Singer and the Hasidic masters and the Kabbalistic masters, there was never any question
mm,
about survival of consciousness after death.
mm,
So one of the lenses that reads the text is through, as I said, sort of post-Enlightenment thinking, rationalist in a rationalist way. And remember, Judaism is a religion in evolution.
mhm,
We're not living today a primarily biblical religion. We don't go out and sacrifice. We sit around a Passover table and tell the story of the rabbis of the rabbinic era, and we reference modern texts, and then we bring in contemporary practices as well. So Judaism is continuing to evolve. So
mhm,
the Judaism of the modern period did not have afterlife
mm.
as a primary issue. I mean, there were a lot of reasons for that. It was also, post-Holocaust Judaism, they didn't want to think about life after
Mm.
death.
Yes.
The mandate at
Mm.
the time was to settle refugees and to guarantee security for Jews in diaspora communities and guarantee the existence of the state of Israel. It wasn't to redeem 6 million souls.
Mm.
But I make a distinction between modern Judaism and contemporary Judaism. The Judaism that's evolving today is much more reclaiming the roots of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and less committed to the secular materialistic paradigm of the 18th and 19th century. So what we're doing is we're looking at both contemporary practices and historical texts and saying, oh wait, this stuff was there all along.
Mm.
Yeah, this stuff was there all along. So that's certainly what I did in writing Jewish Views of the Afterlife. I
Mm.
had to go in and if I asked many of my Jewish contemporaries, do Jews believe in afterlife? They say no, and then I say, well, what do you do about the Book of Samuel,
Mm.
or some other inferences along the way? And they, oh, well, that's interesting. I don't know, I never thought of that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. One other thing that was there, probably from the very beginning, is, and it's one of the most known, maybe even the most known concept of Jewish afterlife, one that also would make quite the history in Christianity, namely that of Sheol. I hope I pronounced this well. This same concept is also often connected to the Greek Hades. And can you say something more about this place or this state, about its origins and its evolution, please?
Okay. If I had a room full of 10 committed, practicing, educated Jews, and I said, what do you have to say about Sheol? They would say, oh yeah, I read references to it in the book of Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
So what Sheol is, and I want to say something about what Sheol is, and whether or not people recognize that as one of the afterlife beliefs are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
So Sheol, in its earliest textual description, was simply an underworld of the dead.
Mm.
It did not have a moral or ethical dimension to it.
Mm.
When Saul goes to the Witch of Endor and brings up from the underworld of Sheol the prophet Samuel's in Sheol. It's
Mm.
not at that point a realm of punishment. It's not at that point a realm of torment.
Mm-hmm.
But over the course of centuries, it it changes and it becomes darker. It becomes a realm of postmortem retribution. It becomes um, hellish,
Mm-hmm.
if you will.
Mm.
And what what happens to Sheol is, there's another body of literature between the end of the biblical period and the dawning of both the New Testament and rabbinic writings, known as the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. The the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. For somebody who reads the Catholic Bible, they know what it is because it's part of the Catholic Bible. But the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha are non-canonical, meaning they didn't make it into the main canon. Hellenistic Jewish literature, that most of it got lost to history, and we reclaimed it from Greek texts. So that in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, in some places, Sheol is coexistent with another realm called Gehenna, which is another underworld term. And when the new era dawns after the sort of the common era, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, comes the common era, and the quote, the rabbis, the progenitors of the next generations of Judaism come on the scene. They're not writing much about Sheol, they're writing about Gehenna. So most modern Jews would be more familiar with the term Gehenna or Gehenna than they would with Sheol. So
But
Sheol,
they stand for basically the same thing.
yes, and it gets more retributive, darker. There are actually there's a whole genre of texts called medieval midrash that are Jewish equivalents of the Dante material. There's a whole genre of literature called Masechet, meaning tractate Gehenna, Masechet Gehenna. There's a whole bunch of sacred hell texts from about 10th, 11th century. So it becomes, afterlife teachings become increasingly complex and diversified throughout time and history. And the biblical layer is the earliest and the simplest. In some sense, I mean simple, I mean not multidimensional and complex.
Yeah, no. It's also, this is very common. Like also in the Greek world, the whole idea of Hades is very simple in the beginning, but then it becomes complex. There becomes Thanatos. The Tartarus gets part of it, so it gets qualified, and there's good parts, there's lesser good parts, there are incredibly bad parts, and you have the same thing in Christianity as well. We start with heaven and hell, and then it becomes a quintuple part. So it's normal that these things happen. So thank you for this. And one other thing. Although we already discussed about this, and obviously this is something that's important. Although there was interest in the afterlife in ancient Judaism, and the confines were never so radical as modern Judaic traditions want us to believe. Somewhere around the 2nd century before the Common Era, the general attitude towards the afterlife in the Judaic tradition changes a lot. There's an enormous amount of interest in topics related to the afterlife. Can you tell us something more about why this change happened, and what changed, and what caused this change in the 2nd century before the Common Era?
So I read your question and I thought I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I do want to respond to what happened in the 2nd century, but I don't agree with the notion that there was more of an interest. I think there was an interest all along.
Okay.
You know,
Yes.
human beings have been living and dying since the beginning of time and history. You know, I mean, people were seeing death happen before their eyes, and in the ancient world, they had to deal with, as we do today, deal with dead bodies. What are you going to do with that? So there were burial chambers. There were ways of dealing with the dead, and as you said, the whole tradition of feeding the dead. They found Israelite burial chambers with little holes in it where they would give people little foodstuffs. You know, a little nosh, a little bite, you know, for the afterlife journey. What happened? What happens in? Are you talking about the 2nd century before the Common Era, or the 2nd century
Before?
after?
No,
Yeah,
before.
yeah. Well, the textual tradition that changes things is the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel is one of the latest Old Testament Hebrew Bible texts. And prior to Daniel, there's Sheol, there's an underworld, there's some punishment. Daniel makes reference to a future time when the dead will be brought back, some to shame and some to everlasting.
Mm-hmm.
Some to shame, some to everlasting life. That becomes the inaugural paradigm for a dualistic view of afterlife, of hell and heaven.
Mm.
And then it begins to develop much more after that.
Mm.
And, it brings in a whole question of resurrection, which I know is on your question list. We haven't got to it yet. Actually, I guess we just did now. But I think that changes the complexity of it. But I don't think that I'd be interested in hearing from you. Why do you think there's more of a focus? Maybe there's more
No,
texts.
maybe I phrased my question badly or superficially, and I agree with what you say. It becomes more complex, and I wanted to know if why it happened then. Is there a cause, or is it just coincidence? Is it all kinds of different things that finally come together, and as history generally works off, or is this something that we can pinpoint and say, well, this happened, and this could explain it? But it's probably
Well,
just a lot of things that
Persia.
came
It's
together.
Persia. It's Persia. It's at that point the whole tradition, not apocryphal, but the whole apocalyptic tradition. The apocalyptic tradition is at the end of days there will be some kind of heavy sh happening. There will be some kind of heavy stuff happening. That apocalyptic tradition gets infused into biblical Judaism
Okay.
after the period of Persian dominance in the fourth and third century, and so the Book of Daniel reflects that, and there's more of a dualistic kind of thinking. That's my best sense
Okay.
of what happened to that period of history,
So it's something that comes in from abroad.
or from down the street, as it were.
Okay. Exactly, because they were there in the beginning. Okay. Now.
Well, no, but also, I mean, Judea was under Persian dominance
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the fourth,
Yeah.
third century.
Mm.
So the Judaism has a wonderful semi-permeable membrane.
Mm.
When I was 13 years old and I started smoking cigarettes, my father blamed it on my cousin. Yeah, and it's often sort of blamed on the Canaanites or the
Mm.
Egyptians or that. But no, Judaism has the ability to evolve and grow and assimilate and integrate in positive ways
Mm.
elements from the surrounding culture.
Mm.
So there are parallels between biblical Sheol and Canaanite traditions. There
Mm-hmm.
are parallels between the book of Daniel and Zoroastrian
Mm-hmm.
traditions and the whole thing of resurrections. There are parallels with Greco-Roman tradition and early biblical ideas of heaven and hell and Gehenna and Gan Eden. Kabbalah gets infused with Sufi mysticism.
Mm.
Today we've assimilated Western rationalism, and now actually, you're doing this as a historical scholar, but in the modern reflection on life after death, it's really the Tibetan Book of the Dead and ideas from the East that are being infused into the new Jewish sense, the sense, the new Jewish sentiment, the new Jewish ideas around life after death. I couldn't have written my book, Jewish Views of the Afterlife, if I had not read writings about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because it gave me a lens to look for little known ideas and really map out or flesh out, which is a weird metaphor to use talking about afterlife, but flesh out a kind of post-mortem journey of the soul. So by the middle age period, it's not simply you go up or down, but there's a whole journey of the soul of different stages of consciousness that replicates what's in the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Okay, that's very interesting.
So when you're ready to do Jewish mysticism,
I'll call you.
Death, we'll talk. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
definitely. I will do that. Now you already went into my last question. So in conclusion, and closely related to the question I just asked you, although for most people the ideas of resurrection and a messianic return are connected with Christianity, both concepts obviously descend from Judaism, and not just from Judaism. We just saw that it came from Persia. Now, can you say something about these concepts within the history of ancient Judaism, please?
It's one of the most complex, confusing concepts.
Mm.
I want to use this for a non-paid, non-political commercial. read the book Jewish Views of the Afterlife. It's now in the third edition. In Jewish Views of the Afterlife, my teacher and mentor, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, writes the foreword, and he writes about resurrection. He says, do I really believe that these molecules will all really return back to life? Do I really believe that this post-mortem, eventually desiccated body will gather back? And if I believe in reincarnation, how many different lifetimes? Which body is it going to be? So he does a kind of contemporary reflection on resurrection, which I refer you back to if you haven't read it closely. It's really quite brilliant. But to go into the historical thinking, for Judaism originally there wasn't that much of a separation. There wasn't a body and soul. That's later Greek. A living person in biblical times is called nefesh chaya, a living spirit, and a dead person is called nefesh met, a dead spirit. The living spirit, nefesh chaya, hangs out in the tribal gathering, the family clan, and then when they die, they hang out with the family tomb. They hang out with the ancestors in the underworld. But you get, by the 5th, 6th century, you get this other idea that the dead will be brought back to life. You find it in Ezekiel, the famous the valley of the dry bones, which may be totally based upon either the exiled Israel coming back to life, or some of the you ever see much about the Temple of Doom in Zoroastrian tradition, where they deck out the bodies and they just have dry bones. So that definitely picked up Persian influence. Remember, they were Ezekiel and his vision down by the waters of Babylon. So you get that. You get Isaiah talking about resurrection with like the dew in ancient Israel, in modern Israel too. The land is so dry, and the dew brings it back to life. So it's sort of this metaphoric sense, and then you have, as I referenced, Daniel. So you get this sense not of what's going to happen to the individual after death, but what's going to happen to the collectivity of Israel. There's a word that scholars throw around like a basketball called eschatology. Eschaton is about the end. Ology is the study. So it's the study of the end. So there's individual eschatology, that what happens to the fate of the individual after death. That's different than collective eschatology. What will happen to the collectivity of Israel at the end of time? And so resurrection is more associated with that, at least in the Old Testament biblical tradition. St. Paul changes that. He says, when you die, you're automatically resurrected in Christ. Um, so it's a very complex concept. And modern Jews, in traditional Jews, we still have that in our liturgy. 3 times a day, we talk about a God who mechaye metim, who brings the dead back to life. And most modernists think, say it, but what does it really mean? So I think part of why we lost touch with the fate of the individual after death in modernity is because the fate of the collectivity of Israel, what'll happen at the end of time, became even more important for a period of time. So I don't know if I've fully explained resurrection, but I've tried to give you a couple of pieces around.
Yes, no, thank you so much, and I think this is a very good way to closing our talk as well with what you said.
Okay, one more. I want to say
yes,
the
please.
daatinstitute.net, DAAT institute.net is where you can find me. I think for me, you're a philosopher and a scholar, and you're doing beautiful work, and you should be able to keep doing this because we need to keep talking about death. We're really entering a new era where we want people to not be so freaked out about death.
Yeah.
But I also work as a bereavement counselor and a psychotherapist, and I think my original attachment to dying and death and to afterlife came out of my own grief experience, and it helps people to know that here's the bottom line in everything I teach: between this world and the world beyond is a window and not a wall. Our rationalist scientific culture says dead is dead, it's a wall. But our mystical traditions and our intuitive knowing, the people's synchronistic experiences, like I had when I was a 21-year-old kid, as I mentioned, and my friend was killed in a car accident, they convince us that there's a window that opens in those moments. So if anybody needs to do some bereavement counseling, I'm available. They can track me down through my website. And I thank you for this opportunity. And call me back when we want to talk about afterlife and Jewish mysticism.
Definitely. So thank you, Simcha, for this extremely pleasant and highly informative talk. And there's a lot more to say, obviously, about the Judaic afterlife. So there will be more. Thanks also to our listeners for having joined me once again in this new episode of Dates with Death. And dear listeners, if you like our volunteer work here at PICT, you can now also consider supporting us, or you can still consider supporting us by becoming an active member of our institution. For more information about how to join PICT, please visit our website. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte. Thank you and goodbye.